It's my privilege today to be speaking with Shannon Mattern, who has written Code and Clay, Data and Dirt, 5,000 Years of Urban Media. And I thought, Shannon, maybe we could start with that number. 5,000 years is obviously a huge amount of things to cover. And you're looking at urban environments and the media and the way that those two things fit together over a vast amount of time. How did you do that, and where did you even begin?
Sure. Well, it's a book that was a very long time in the making. So I started collecting materials back when I was a graduate student, over 15 years ago. When I have amassed, over those 15 years, several, probably close to a dozen 3-ring binders full of material. And then, once I kind of shifted my files to PDF files, I had several folders on my desktop related to this. I mean, I think the scale of stuff I collected over that period of time kind of felt like it was the equivalent of a 5,000-year archive over that span of time. But really, it began in an application for a postdoctoral fellowship, honestly. So as I was finishing up my PhD program, which I did in New York City during the first dot-com boom. So I was both fascinated by, first of all, these people who were living this lavish lifestyle. I was living kind of the pauperish lifestyle of a graduate student, but also somewhat frustrated by all of the boosterous claims they were making about how these new apps and locative media, etc., would transform the world. And being somebody who studied media history as a graduate student, I recognized that many of the proclamations they were making were things we had heard many times before. Every time a new technology comes into existence, the telegraph, the printing press, writing, etc., we have bold claims of the hopes and fears that it will make possible. So I think just the lack of historical sensibility of a lot of the first dot-com boom boosters was, mildly frustrating to me. And then when I was applying for this postdoctoral fellowship, I was invited to, as part of my application, submit sample syllabi for 2 dream classes. And one of those was a course on media and architecture. So I wanted to work through history, looking at how different media technologies through different ages of transformation have shaped the way we design buildings, the way we experience our cities, the way we navigate and understand urban navigation. So really the idea of the book was born in that syllabus 15 years ago. And I decided ultimately that I wanted to do a deep history, drawing on a couple different things that were happening in other fields. First of all, the fact that history itself was doing kind of big histories. That was a kind of a resurgent trend in that field. But then also I was working to some degree in the field of media archaeology within media studies. And I wanted to literalize that and actually see what archaeologists could teach us about media and urban history. So all of those different kind of frameworks and histories, trajectories coming together ultimately produced this book.
It makes me think that some of the best work, including your own, seems to come when it connects with somewhat different disciplines. At the same time, I think a lot of people don't necessarily do that because it can be intimidating, I guess, to not stick to the field that you are most familiar with. And so I'm wondering, how do you negotiate when you're dealing with, I guess, among other things, you can be thinking about architecture, archaeology, media studies, and I'm sure a number of other things that we could list. How do you negotiate sort of where you fit or how you connect with various disciplines? Because this is very much, I think, an interdisciplinary book.
Yeah, it definitely is. It's a tricky place to be kind of an interdisciplinary scholar, and it can be a little intimidating, especially for junior scholars who decide that's what they want to be. They want to kind of straddle the fence between different disciplines because sometimes then you're held to the standards of those disparate disciplines, which, is maybe a little unfair, but also it's quite a challenge to live up to. In my case, I think I've always been kind of interdisciplinary, and I attribute that in part to naivete, honestly, not being super hyper-professionalized in my own training, and that is no knock to my training itself. It kind of was just my own lack of sophistication and knowing what questions to ask about how to properly professionalize myself. I found that the most interesting responses to the questions that I found most interesting didn't really lie within the literature or the practice in any particular field. And coming to New York for graduate school, I was just kind of overwhelmed in a wonderful way by the breadth of different cultural currents that came together. So I just started out reading across multiple disciplines. I think it also helped that my own background was pretty interdisciplinary. I started out, in high school thinking I wanted to be an engineer. and doing internships in engineering. These were kind of high school scaled internships. I don't want to kind of inflate their importance or anything. And then was a chemistry major, thinking I wanted to go to medical school. So being exposed to all these different epistemological worlds kind of, I would like to think, helped me to translate kind of between the different methodologies and frameworks and truth claims that different fields make. So that was really helpful in figuring out how to read across different disciplines.
What do you say that you fall under, I guess, do you even think about it as certain disciplines that you are connecting?
Well, again, I do realize that my answer to this will probably come from a position of privilege because, I am beyond the stage in my career when I have to worry about getting tenure, so I realize these are questions that junior scholars and people who are in more precarious positions do have to constantly ask themselves, which is very frustrating. That said, I don't really ask myself that question anymore. In fact, when I get invited for talks in different places, one of my favorite introductions is when people say, through no prompting of my own, they'll just, start to introduce me and then pause and say, I don't even know what to call you. And I love that. I love the fact that maybe I'm frustratingly or refreshingly, I don't know, uncharacterizable. So, some people call me a theorist, and that really doesn't feel right to me. There is a certain connotation and weight to the term theorist. It doesn't feel right. Yes, I'm housed in a media studies program, and that's where my PhD training was in that field. Mm-hmm. But I also did work across urban studies. I am invited a lot to talk with archaeologists and geographers and with people in library and information science and archives. So I think also just the fact that folks in these other fields actually invite me into their conversations is a bit of validation. It gives me a sense that I must be doing something right here. I must be kind of doing justice to their field, validating the work that they do in their own disciplines. So that has given me confidence in kind of embracing the fact that I am working in this interspace, this liminal space.
And that brings me to the next part of that question, I guess, which is you are coming from certain backgrounds or considering yourself part of or not part of certain ideas. But when you're writing, and especially when you're writing this, Code and Clay, who are you picturing reading it?
Well, this book had, of course, when you write a book proposal, one of the things you have to do is to identify the potential target markets, quote unquote. Mm-hmm. So I imagined people, in my own supposedly proper field of media studies, and particularly given, as I said before, the popularity over the past few years of the subfield of media archaeology. I imagined that it would appeal to people in that field, but also some secondary fields, architects, urban planners, geographers, information scientists, maybe art historians as well. So the people in all the different fields that I'm drawing upon, or whose literature and practice I'm drawing upon in the book, but not only scholars, but also practitioners in those fields, plural. And then also, as I mentioned in the introduction, I'm kind of using this deep history as a counter story or a way of offering a deep historical contextualization to very contemporary and presentist and future-oriented ways of thinking about city making today. Really hoping that the people who are involved in a lot of these kind of frustrating smart city debates that are happening in cities all around the world, I'm not sure if they'll read it, but at least I hope that the historical sensibility that I'm advocating for and the recognition of other forms of intelligence that are built into spaces will ideally expand the debate about smart cities and make them not so limited in their focus on kind of an algorithmic and efficient forms of intelligence.
I'm trying to imagine how you went about writing this because, as you said, it took a long time, and it was I'm sure a huge collection of stuff that you didn't even get to that you had researched. But when you started, did you start with a certain idea in mind? Like right now, the chapters go effectively from radio to print to writing and stone. Speaking through stone, did you start like that, or did that come to be later on in the process, dividing it into sort of different media and how they shape cities?
Well, I will say that in the time that I was working or thinking about this book, not actively, it's not as if I started a manuscript and then set it aside for 10 years. I was just new. I had a little list of projects, aspirational projects, and this book was always on there. But in the interim, I wrote 2 other books and, like 50 or 75 other articles, really kind of came into my own, I guess you could say, as like a public scholar, started to write for more public venues. So those experimenting with those other forms of writing, including especially for a more general audience, not necessarily an academic audience, was really freeing. And I could try out ideas. A lot of things that ultimately made it into the book were ideas or concepts or parts of chapters that made their way into the book in some way. So I was thinking through a patchwork quilt version of the book kind of unbeknownst to me, it did ultimately come together into the finished book. But I will say also that, as I mentioned earlier, the idea of the book was born in a class. And as I taught that class maybe 5 or 6 times over the course of a decade, I ultimately came to realize, just for the sake of, good pedagogy, that a reverse chronological order made much more sense to my students. So originally, when I taught it as a freshman seminar, I started off by going in chronological order. So, you have these 18-year-olds, and you start off the semester by talking about clay tablets and Çatalhöyük in, an ancient city, which doesn't mean a whole lot to them, to be honest. So ultimately, after teaching the class a couple of times, I realized, what if instead we flip the script and start with the present day, and then dig further and further backwards in time, and the students will see all of these tropes and morphologies and hopes and dreams recurring, echoing as we go further and further back in history. And as we're taking them further away from the time and places that are familiar to them, there's still a potential kind of rhetorical connection, a way for them to understand it, because we see those recurring themes over and over again. So this idea of the reverse chronological order was born again in my pedagogical evolution over the years, but also, again, it really fit the whole methodology of digging that is central to media archaeology as well. So I kind of took that literally and saw how stones and bones archaeologists with shovels in the dirt could offer a methodology, not only research methodology, but a methodology for writing as well.
And I remember reading that and finding it very interesting because, I hadn't necessarily thought about doing that myself, but now I may try something similar. Have you found that works, the reverse chronology, in different classes or in different subjects, or is it really in sort of the media and the cities that it works best?
I think it could probably work in a lot of different classes. Like if you were teaching a class on the history of the book, for instance, I could see it doesn't have to be a strict reverse chronological order, but it maybe doesn't make the most sense to put the deepest historical artifacts at the beginning of the semester. Maybe you could have a flashback in the middle of the semester, or something that helps the students kind of get a grasp of the critical issues that are central to the class or the vocabulary, and base that in artifacts and processes and practices that are a bit more familiar with a lower barrier to entry for them. And then kind of find the appropriate place to start kind of digging backwards in history. I teach a class on maps as well, where we don't start with the history of mapping, where we kind of introduce these other genealogies and historical traditions after we spend a few weeks talking about the future of mapping at the beginning of the the beginning of the semester, that is. And I employ kind of other similar approaches in a bunch of different other classes too.
Well, and it makes a lot of sense that, as you said, there's less of a barrier, particularly to students or people who haven't become familiar with this. It was an interesting concept that, at least from my reading of it, worked really nicely. Did it prevent you from doing anything that you would have otherwise done, do you think? Like, did it have any drawbacks, or did it have any implications in that way that you've structured it that you maybe didn't anticipate at the beginning?
Well, there is a methodological danger that historians offer caveats against, and that's the whole idea of Whig history or presentism, where you essentially use all of these very contemporary metaphors to talk about things that happened in the past. So, for example, you'll look at like a clay tablet from Mesopotamia, and you'll say like, "Wow, that looks like an iPhone," for instance. So humans have always been destined for iPhones because look, we were building kind of analog versions of them 5,000 years ago, which obviously isn't true. So part of it is to still allow for those tropes to be recurring throughout the different chapters as we move backwards in history, but not allow when you do use these contemporary metaphors, to make sure you're using scare quotes and to not overuse that whole kind of strategy as well. So that's the challenge of allowing people to reconnect those historical things to the present, but not enforcing presentism itself. So that was one of the challenges.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. Who helps you think through, especially in writing this? Is there one voice, would you say, like be it a theorist or a colleague or academic or somebody? Are there certain people that really helped you in terms of thinking through what you were doing? And if so, who would you recommend maybe reading or checking out the work of?
Well, there are quite a few people, and some of them are, long gone historical thinkers who have written books that are canonical that were really inspirational to me. I cite Lewis Mumford in the book a few times, or actually throughout many of the chapters in the book. And I remember reading him in graduate school. And again, he had a very ambitious scope to a lot of his projects too, like writing books about the entire history of technology, or two huge books about the entire history of cities around the world. So I did take some inspiration from him. But also, I think I had a really formative meeting with a bunch of colleagues several years before I actually even started to write the book, just when I was thinking about its form in a very abstract way. It was a group of colleagues from NYU, including Lisa Gittleman, whose work has been really inspirational to me over the years. Not only the subject matter, but just like her voice, the creative subjects she chooses. Gabriella Coleman was there, who's also very well known as an anthropologist of hackers and online communities, and not short a book about Anonymous. Finn Brunton is another kind of media historian and cultural critic. And Tom Oxt, who's a cultural historian who writes a bit about libraries. So these folks were all in a room helping me think through just how I could turn this jumble of ideas into a book. So they really kind of gave me some of the initial ideas about thinking about formal chapters. And then maybe even there, this reverse chronological idea was finally validated. I don't recall exactly, but all those people I just mentioned who were in that room, their work has in some way been inspirational to me. Both their published work and their kind of embodied presence in that conversation was really formative.
In terms of a goal, maybe for yourself in writing this book, is there anything that you were telling yourself why this ought to be written and why you really wanted to do this project?
Well, some of the reasons I mentioned already. First of all, that I have done, a lot of the public writing I have done has been about data-driven urbanism, smart cities, this very efficiency-minded, algorithmic vision of what types of intelligences, plural, we want to build into our cities. And I'm always criticizing the myopia of those visions. So this book, as I mentioned earlier, was in part a response to that, or an attempt to encourage people who were engaged in those very contemporary debates and discussions and design decisions and policy discussions to think about how we can learn a bit from history, not a bit, a lot from history, about how to kind of broaden and ensure that there are different values that are considered in those contemporary discussions also. So that was a key consideration. And then I also was hoping, because so much of this book has come out of different conversations I've had with students in my classes over the years, I was really hoping that it would be a generative project for classroom discussion to help students to think more deeply historically, to help them to think about methodology more creatively, to help them to, again, remember that there are precursors and alternative genealogies to the technologies that we tend to fetishize so often today. So that was another key group that I had in mind, like undergraduate and graduate students and their teachers.
Could you say maybe more about what is the issue with people who see that the city will be this perfect algorithmic space that can be perfectly planned? I mean, what are some of the issues that people ought to worry about who maybe aren't thinking about it or the repercussions of that?
Oh, well, there's been a lot of contemporary journalism, cultural criticism, a lot written about this. There are tons of scholars who are talking about this. So I just want to acknowledge that I'm definitely not the single authoritative voice on this subject. There's a lot of writing in this area. So one of the issues is that thinking about if you regard intelligence as something that an algorithm can offer you, or it's based in kind of purely computational terms, there's a certain logic and ethos, a politics that is built into that really tends to bracket out other ways of thinking about place-based knowledge, like indigenous knowledge, embodied knowledge, situational knowledge, things that, can't easily be quantified and algorithmicized. Like, what types of values do you want to essentially define urban coexistence? If it's things like trust, meaningful inefficiencies in some cases, to quote Eric Gordon, maybe a good amount of friction is actually a positive thing. So these types of things are kind of hard to fit into an algorithmic model that is focused primarily on efficiency. Cambridge Analytica and other recent scandals have demonstrated to us there are certain populations that are marginalized or just not even seen and counted for in kind of an algorithmic universe. So there are issues of social justice and representation and equity that are now people are thinking about. But I think when we assumed that the machine knew best and the machine was kind of not sullied by politics, was not prone to bias because it didn't have all of the errors and moral weaknesses of human beings, we now realize that's not true, that humans program essentially their own biases into the machines that they're creating. So I think those are other things that a more humanistic approach to these planning decisions can remind us of.
If you could steer it in your own desired way, and I'm sure your goal is not to be a dictator or to say what those cities should or shouldn't do, but if you could steer the conversation in an ideal way, what would that look like in terms of city planning and the kind of city media that you're talking about?
Well, as you're right, I definitely don't want to be a dictator. That's such a huge question, and I am always a little, I wouldn't say allergic to, but scared of kind of predicting the future. But I would hope that a future is taking advantage of all the fantastic things that conveniences and efficiencies and equalizing potentials that new technologies do have to offer to us. Like if you think of what new technology could do for public health, or medical records, etc. There are great things that could happen there. Precision medicine has lots of great promise, but also recognizing that quote unquote old media or unmediated forms of knowledge, all of the stuff that actually exists in a seamful way between human beings or between humans and other species. I mean, these are things that aren't necessarily that is rendered obsolete or moot once new technology comes in and seems to supplant them. So just remembering that there's a potential for a coexistence of the old and the new, hence the title of the book. You can have both code and clay and data and dirt and ether and ore living together in an urban environment. And it's not a matter that the new necessarily has to supplant the logics of the old. So allowing for these things to coexist and recognizing multiple forms of smartness that have been kind of developed over the course of, the entire history of human evolution, or human kind of urban existence, at least. There's no reason that those can't all be informing each other.
Well, and for somebody, I guess, who's not, say, an archaeologist or a architect or doing the kind of city planning that would be directly effective in terms of having voices heard and making changes, what would you recommend someone do as potentially like a next step if they read your book and are interested in that same kind of discourse being perpetuated? Other than, continuing to read, is there anything that you would recommend for people maybe in various urban spaces or outside them that want to further this conversation?
Sure. I mean, there are lots of community planning organizations, groups that work with different forms of community activism. I would imagine that particularly as well-meaning technocrats in cities or corporations who are promoting their smart city applications to different cities come into town, that there are ways to develop different design methodologies, different research methodologies to acknowledge these other forms of intelligence that are embodied in the city and its communities. I think also it has a lot of potential for pedagogy in the classroom at multiple levels, all the way from kind of elementary school up through college and graduate school, reminding students, for example, where their technology comes from, how there is a history to so many of the values and beliefs that we tend to just reify today. So I think that those are really important lessons to remind people of, just for the sake of public discourse, for the sake of having empathy for other ways of thinking about things, about recognizing the constructiveness, quote unquote, of our value systems, for instance. So that's maybe a bit abstract and kind of aspirational, but I do think that there are big kind of public realm, public sphere issues at stake here, and recognizing the networks, the historical and global networks that actually form the technologies and cities that we're living in and using today.
If you could build on this, I mean, I'm sure you're working on new stuff now. I'm not sure if you're planning to continue sort of building on what you've done here or if you're going in new directions, but maybe you could say a little bit about where you go from having published them.
Sure. So a lot of my work for the past couple of years has been really driven by invitations. So I might be invited to give keynotes in different places. And I'm not one of those people, I should really know better, but I'm not one of those people who says, okay, here are the 3 talks I'm doing this year, pick one. Instead, I say, what would you like me to talk about? So that means I write a lot of new talks every year. But fortunately, a lot of them end up becoming articles. I have realized over the years that I really do like the essay form. Essay, article, whatever you want to call it. The essay has a bit less pressure for me, so I like calling my work essays. Actually, much more than writing books, to be honest. So it's not to say that I won't write more books, but I really like writing these essays. So right now, I am currently working on a bunch of different projects. One is all kind of more small scale. So One is about the history of product sound design, which was inspired by a recent rock workshop I did. But so, for example, everything from the beeps and boops on our computers, and then tracing that back historically again as well. That whole reverse chronological thing. Seeing how we've designed the sound of our vacuum cleaners and the sound that we want our food packaging to make, the burp of the Tupperware seal, the sound of our car engines, and how those have been acoustically engineered, and seeing essentially how far back I can trace that, which isn't so much connected to the cities thing. But then I transferred some of the thinking I did there to another project. I was invited to contribute something to a project on logistics. So I was wondering what we can learn about logistical systems at the global and very hyper-local scale by listening to them. What kind of sonic cues do they give about global flows, for instance? So that's something that is kind of related to the whole of the spatial issues I'm talking about in the book. A couple other projects, I was invited to do a keynote on scale that's coming up soon, so I'm not quite sure what that will be, but I'm sure that will draw on some ideas or methodologies that I've kind of practiced through the book. So those are just a couple of the things. And then one kind of longer term project that I've been doing over the course of, several years is about furniture. So while the Code and Clay book is about macro scale things, 5,000 years, cities around the world, I've kind of gone to the opposite end of scale and looked at the tiny object of furniture. So everything from the history of the bookshelf to the history of desks, storage media. So how we have designed objects to help us organize, store, and make accessible different media throughout history. And that project is inspired in part because I grew up in a hardware store. My dad's a furniture maker, so it's been a part of who I am for my entire life. So I kind of thought it would be and other scholars like Lynn Spiegel has been really inspirational. She's done a lot of work in this area. So this is maybe, it's a way related to the Code and Clay book in that it has pushed me to think in a totally different scale. So moving from the scale of cities and infrastructures all the way down to the tiny scale of the shelf and the chair.
It makes me curious, actually, when you think about writing then, generally, are you thinking about writing as a presentation, or are you thinking about writing, a written text that you will obviously give at a talk or something? Are you thinking of it as an oral speech, or are you thinking of it as an essay? Because when I hear essay, I think a written work, right?
That's a great question, and I think it depends on which invitation comes first, or which inspiration I have first. In many cases, a lot of the stuff I've published over the past few years does come out of invitations to give a talk somewhere. So I am thinking about it, not only what I'm going to put on the page to read, and I do typically read my talks just because when I extemporize, I go off on way too many tangents. So I kind of make myself stick to a script of some sort, try to make it animated and engaging, I hope, but still I'd like to have a paper in front of me. But as I'm thinking about the text and the argument, I'm also thinking about how to illustrate it. So I think I'm known fairly well for having heavily illustrated, heavily image research presentations. So I do a lot of historical and archival research and kind of to put together a lot of slides with a lot of really, what I think are really good images. So, for an hour long or 45-minute talk, I could easily spend probably 20 hours putting together the slides because I want the perfect images. So as I'm writing, I'm thinking and making little margin notes to myself about how I want the imagistic version of the argument to unfold. So there is where maybe I think that the oral and the written components or versions of my research are kind of mutually informing each other as I'm making them.
Actually, I wanted to ask about the size of the book. Did you choose? This is a larger book. It's from University of Minnesota Press. Were you responsible for the size of this?
I was not. So I was pleasantly, I honestly, when I saw the marketing material, I didn't even really pay much attention to the dimensions because typically they say, this many images, this many pages, and they give the dimensions in the marketing copy. And it wasn't until I got my shipment of books shortly before it became publicly available and opened up the box and thought, I was not expecting this. What a pleasant surprise. So I am appreciative that it is it's cut with a slightly larger size, but no, it wasn't something that I had any input on.
Okay, well, because I was wondering, and I'm sure it was, in a way, designed for the images you use. Yeah, you have a lot of images in here, and I was wondering about those images. I know some of them are public domain. I think some of them maybe you've taken yourself.
Yeah.
But in general, did you find it difficult? Because I know a lot of academics try to not use images or don't like doing it because either you'll have to pay yourself for copyright, or you'll just have to go through lots and lots of paperwork. Like, I was looking at your book and I was just imagining how many forms that would be. But could you just say a little bit about how you chose the images and what that experience was like?
That is a great question, and not one that many people think about. And I'm so glad you asked about it because, again, it is a huge part of every research project I do. Because, as I said, I'm always thinking about how to illustrate it. Or in the case of my sound research, what sound files can I use to illustrate or to exemplify these arguments I'm making? So in this case, as I was collecting a lot of this research material over a decade and a half, I was also marking. When I take my notes on them, I would mark in a highlighted font, great image on page 64 or whatever. And then as I did the manuscript, I would insert, and again, highlighted text, potential images that I could use. And of course, by the time I had a full manuscript, I had 500 images that I would love to include in the book, way more than I could possibly use. So then it became a process of whittling down, seeing what redundancies were there, which were expendable. Some images you have to cut simply because you can't find the copyright holder, or because the copyright holder is going to ask you $1,000 for the reproduction, even though it's a non-profit publisher. And I have traditionally done all of my image work myself, which is a huge time investment. You're totally right. It's bureaucratic hell, to be honest.
Yeah, and I couldn't believe when I saw all these pictures, yeah.
I remember my first book, which is about libraries. I used a lot of images I took myself, but then with a lot of professional architectural photographers and from the libraries themselves. That was honestly 3 full months of work in a summer, just doing the image rights. This time, I have to give props. I saved up all of my research assistant hours. I didn't have an RA for like the whole year preceding and after, and I used all those hours and all that funding to hire a fantastic research assistant. His name is Josh McWhirter. He and I worked together, and rather than just giving him the drudge work of sending out the letters and tracking their, the responses, he and I worked together and read the manuscript together and thought about how to make a rhetorical visual argument. So I really wanted him to have a meaningful work. So I kind of gave him, hopefully, a sense of ownership over the project too. And then he did ultimately do a lot of the managing of the finding the rights holder in some cases. In some cases, we couldn't find them, so he and I would work together to identify a potential substitute image or look for a public domain option or something on Flickr. So it was a lot of negotiation with him, and it was still a lot of work for me, but really he did the majority of the administrative work, and he was really fantastic to work with. So I do owe a lot of credit, and I'm really grateful to him. But you're right, on the whole, incorporating images in books adds months of full-time work to the process.
And considering that, other than having an assistant, which would be great, I'm sure, for anyone, is there any other advice you would give to other academics or anyone thinking about publishing, even in journals or what have you, and collecting a significant number of images? Because, yeah, again, in my experience, I've used a couple images maybe at a time, and that was a little bit of a headache. But for somebody who's thinking about publishing using a lot of images, that can be really time-consuming, but also potentially really expensive. What advice, if any, do you have for somebody thinking about that in an early stage?
That is a really good question, and it's probably something I have learned through trial and error and a lot of error over the years that I don't know that I've ever kind of reflected on it and codified the lessons learned. But I would say keep track of interesting images you find, even through the stages of doing research, from primary research, secondary research, all along, as you're taking notes on different sources, as you're making digital images of the archive. Make sure you're keeping good track of things that are good enough that they are candidates for inclusion in the final published product. Public domain, there are lots of libraries in particular who have been much more active on the open access public domain front. I think it was a couple years ago, the New York Public Library just put out a couple 100,000 new materials, images, prints, maps, etc. that seem to be essentially orphan works or that are explicitly in the public domain that they made available. The British Library has a lot. The Wellcome Trust has a lot. So finding great public domain resources and then looking on Instagram and Flickr and other kind of crowdsourced projects too. Those you can find some often really nice photographs of things that you would otherwise have to pay a professional photographer hundreds, if not thousands of dollars to use. I do also have to acknowledge that I have spoken about this issue with some of my architectural historian and art historian friends. And in many cases, they have been they're dealing with a very visual topic. They want to be able to show the building they're writing about. And in many cases, they have either had to scrap projects or have felt that their research has really been compromised because they've been asked to pay thousands and thousands of dollars to reproduce images and they just can't do it. So in many cases, if you have a very image dependent argument, it is not completely, but to a very scarily large degree dependent upon how well that whole infrastructure of rights clearances is going to cooperate with you. So yeah, it's can be a risky choice in some cases.
Well, did you find yourself having to pay a lot of rights fees in this book?
Not a whole lot, to be honest. I mean, there were a couple images, for example, the guys dancing with the boombox, the women sitting on the rooftop in Berlin listening to the radio. Some of those we paid, and some of the images from contemporary artists, we did pay their galleries or their artists themselves some money. Some of the other ones, like that, the women on the rooftop listening to the radio, we had to pay art resources, which was kind of like I'm not actually sure what you would call their business, like a rights clearance warehouse, I guess you could say, for lack of a better term. So I'd say probably no more than 1,000 altogether, which is actually really good for a book with maybe, I don't know, over 40 images in it. Originally I had 90, and then we had to cut it down for the publisher, but $1,000 total for 40 images. Also, I have to say, when you write, even places like commercial galleries, which otherwise want to monetize the people they represent, if I told them a bit about the book and said it was for, I'm not going to be making much, if any, money on it at all, some of them were really accommodating. And the artists then got really excited by the project and allowed us to use their material for free. So often it's the way you talk about the project when you're asking for permission to use it. If you pitch it in a way that actually resonates for the rights holder, in some cases they could waive fees for you or offer you a really good deal. So that was really something that came in very handy on several occasions.
How do you, think about the audio then? Because I can imagine if you're presenting something, you can maybe play audio. How do you best incorporate audio into your work, if at all? I mean, do you keep different files, as I think you said? Do you catalog them in a similar way to the photos, or is that a different process for you as you're doing this kind of research? Because a lot of this book is about audio, or at least a significant chunk is, right?
Right. I have not been as good at that. I remember I did this long trip to the the National Archives a few years ago, and collected all this really great material about historical audio recording, the history of the Bell, I forget exactly which corporation, the history of Western Union, AT&T, all these other kind of historical media companies, and collected all of these recordings on a CD-ROM. And then over the years, I've lost those CD-ROMs. I now have computers that don't even have CD-ROM drives anymore. So I have been much less successful in developing a good workflow for that area. I am sure there are lots of other scholars who specifically work on audio archives and who are more squarely in the field of sound studies, which I'm really not, who have a much better answer for you in terms of how to manage the sound workflow.
Well, I'm also curious because, in writing, it's difficult, of course, to talk about sound. If it's an image, you can potentially show the image. Did you have any strategies when you were talking? Because, you talk about how certain cityscapes will have certain sounds, and then historically, which I found really interesting, especially the ways that buildings had been constructed to either project voices or to do certain acoustic things. Was there a strategy you used to talk about sound, considering the fact that you can't really do an audio version of your book, or at least not where people can look at it and listen to it like they can a photo?
Right. Well, I will say that one of the books that's been really inspirational in this regard is Emily Thompson's book, published 2002, I think, called The Soundscape of Modernity. I quote it in my book. She worked with Vectors, this really great kind of multimodal publication at USC a few years ago, to develop an online version of the book called The Roaring Twenties, where she went through various New York City archival collections from, I think, the radio station, different kind of city records, and pulled out audio recordings and video of the various kind of noise complaints that people have documented throughout the early 20th century in New York City. So that is an interactive website that sonifies the argument she's making in this print-based book. In my case, I found, actually one of the things that Thompson also does is recognizes that sometimes you have to rely essentially do kind of a synesthetic transfer. See how you can actually hear how an image resonates in some cases. So there are some images you can look at and they're noisy images because there's an implication of sound happening in them. Same thing with texture. In the book, I try to emphasize that these are multisensorial places, that even text is not just a visual medium, that texture, the substrate it's printed on, the way it's carved into the facade of a building, that textural element has just a very integral part to how it communicates to an urban public as well. So I tried to find lots of images that either hinted at sonification or had a haptic dimension to them. So it captured texture as well. Finding images that kind of synesthetically reference these other senses.
I'm curious now, when you think about the way that you've constructed this work and others, where you are starting with a sort of contemporary period, breaking it down perhaps, and then going further back in history, has that given you more of a sense of what to anticipate? And again, I don't want necessarily to ask you an impossible question like, what will the future hold for cities? But has it made you think about certain things as we move into the future, considering the fact that you've looked at this massive history? Has it lended itself to thinking about the future for you?
Sure. Maybe primarily, and this might be a frustrating answer, people keep repeating history. I mean, this is not a novel insight at all, that going back to what I said earlier, the hopes and dreams that we have about each new technology, we have had very similar hopes and dreams essentially for every technology we have introduced over millennia. So if I'm projecting into the future, I guess the safest prediction I could say is like, we're going to do that again. We're going to keep doing that. We're going to keep forgetting about historical inefficiencies, injustices, unintended consequences that happen when we introduce new technologies. Or we're going to fear all of these potentially bad things that can happen, as we have done every time a new technology is introduced. Mm-hmm. So that's probably my safest prediction, is we're just going to keep doing that, sadly.
Yeah. No, I'd say that you're probably right with that. Thinking about that, though, in a long historical context, does that make you, I guess, less optimistic, maybe more skeptical about new media technologies? Or how do you feel about the next best thing? Can you still be excited about new technology, or does it kind of ruin it for you?
Maybe you're asking the wrong person, because I guess maybe I tend to be a bit curmudgeonly about a lot of new things. I am not a Luddite because I have plenty of technology, but I am maybe a consciously late adopter in some cases. So I am typically skeptical of new theory when it's really trendy. So I'll read about it, but I'll be very wary of how it's being used and not tending to want to kind of incorporate it in my own work while it seems to be so ubiquitous in everybody else's work. And then maybe after the hype has died down a bit, I'll see what its staying power is. And if it actually seems to be something that's worth sticking around, I'll consider actually using it in my own work. Same with technology. Like, I don't download the new updates until a week or two later, until I realize or figure out if there are lots of bugs in them, for instance. So that's, a smaller temporal scale. But I think, I don't know that I would call myself skeptical, but maybe cautiously optimistic is a right way of putting it. So I approach both theory, academic currents, and fashion that way, and technologies.
When you're working on this and when you're thinking about cityscapes, especially urban environments, I'm just curious, could you take me through how you walk around New York, maybe? Like, does it change when you're thinking about acoustic space? Do you start listening more when you're thinking about radio waves? Do you think more about those kinds of things? Or would you say that you generally walk around the same as you always?
No, I think that thinking about these types of things, again, for essentially the entire time I've lived in New York, which is close to 20 years now, I started to think about a lot of these concepts that made their way into the book when I started grad school. I wouldn't have articulated them the same way. These ways of experiencing and perceiving have, I think, been with me for a long time. So I am often very much attuned to sound and how the barometric pressure or weather or moisture in the air on a different day makes sound resound in a very different way. Or how the really loud car speaker I hear on Irving Place becomes totally inaudible when I turn the corner onto 17th Street. I think for a while about how that slight shift in orientation has essentially completely changed my acoustic universe. So I am thinking about sound often. I also think about ubiquity of waves that are passing through, that are essentially filling up these seemingly empty spaces in our streets and parks. It's a little scary to think about the ubiquity of waves and electromagnetic spectrum that you're essentially walking through and that are passing through your body every day. which is why some people choose to remove themselves and put themselves in kind of quiet zones, like the famous one in West Virginia. So yeah, I think I am thinking often about the way different immaterial forms of communication are filling the spaces that I walk through every day.
I'm trying to imagine, because I was telling a couple of people when I was reading your book, that it was interesting, and did you know this, did you know that? And the one thing that I found difficult to sort of articulate was, and I don't mean to be rude at all, because I do think this is a great book, but I think a lot of people want to kind of ignore it, as you said. They don't want to think about the radio waves around them and the noises that are happening and stuff like that. Why do you think it's important that we do consider that? What is it about this project that you think is important for people to not ignore?
Well, I will say that there seems to be a pretty sizable population. It might be a fringe group that I am just aware of because of my own interests. That there are lots of people who are interested in infrastructure. And, the past several years, we've seen tons of design and art projects on making visible the invisible, which has become, a hackneyed phrase by now. But so there does seem to be a huge group of people who are into this seemingly esoteric stuff. But there are a couple reasons why I think it's worth caring about, one of which that I don't really talk so much about in the book. There are entire other books that are about the potential health effects. And I'm not sure that I can't necessarily speak definitively or confidently about the scientific research that supports these claims, but some concern about what it's actually doing to our bodies to be walking through spaces that are filled with communicating devices. Mm-hmm. Again, I don't want to speak to that because I don't know enough about it. I just know that it is an ongoing debate. Also, it's partly the historical argument I made before, that recognizing that we think we're living in a place when things are ethereal. We use so many metaphors. The cloud, for instance, as many people have noted, is a really convenient metaphor because it both naturalizes and ephemeralizes the way we communicate to each other. But reminding us that there's a huge material infrastructure to allow for all of this seemingly placeless, materialist form of interaction. And that material is in the form of data centers and wires that are capacious and voluminous, and electromagnetic waves, which have material impacts on our bodies too. So it's an ontological thing. It's a philosophical, historical. Whether people are turned on by those kinds of arguments is, I don't know. I can't necessarily make people care about ontology if they're not into philosophy. But those are some of the reasons that I think they're useful, interesting, and hopefully useful to know.
Well, I guess one of my last questions then is, where would you like this kind of research to go? So not necessarily your own, but when you think about media ecology, media archaeology, what are some of the things that you're hoping people will start to do? Because as you said, there is a great group of people doing research in that area right now, including yourself. What would you like to see happen in the next, 5 to 10 years?
Well, I think some of it is already happening, and it's not work that I'm doing. You mentioned media ecology. That's actually the tradition I came out in grad school. I graduated in a program about media, or it was called media ecology. Mm-hmm. I've kind of moved a bit away from some of the foundational texts there, but still it's with me, definitely. And you can probably see it in the ecological framework of the book. But there are lots of people who are working on media and the environment, media and sustainability or resilience, looking at supply chains, the ecological impact of supply chains and end of life and recycling, et cetera, of technological objects. So there are quite a few people who are working in that realm. And then in terms of archaeology, I still think that there is a lot to be learned from other peripheral disciplines, people who think about media in a way that media studies people or communication studies or technological or critical code studies people maybe aren't asking. If we look to some of these other disciplines, we realize that they're talking about things like proto-algorithms or coded forms of communication or mediated objects in a way that we would never think to frame them. But there's a lot to be learned about these other disciplinary modalities and methodologies. So I think there's a lot of great potential for cross-pollination between the more technologically oriented contemporary focused fields and those with a different disciplinary or spatial or temporal alignment.
As I said, you're a great example of some of that kind of work, and in particular, Code and Clay, Data and Dirt. And yes, Shannon, I just want to thank you for taking the time to speak with us today and to talk about your book.
Well, thank you again very much for having me.